This statement by Jesus in John chapter 6 is one of the more confusing or off-putting statements in all of the Gospels when he says that, effectively, those who follow him need to eat his flesh and drink his blood. It's because of this statement and ones like it, particularly in connection with the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, that in the early church, the first few centuries, Christians had a reputation as cannibals among non-Christians because of Jesus saying things like this. To get at what he means, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, we're going to need to see the extended passage in context, because it really does clarify this seemingly strange statement. To set the scene, Jesus has just miraculously fed the 5,000, and then, crossing to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, he's walked on the water. The people then come to him looking for more signs, and instead of just welcoming them, Jesus confronts them. Truly, truly, I say to you, you're seeking me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. And from that point on, this scene between Jesus and the crowds and even other disciples gets increasingly contentious. Jesus is unwilling to have followers who come to him only for material benefits. He does not allow them to treat him as some sort of spiritual vending machine. To simply benefit from a miracle isn't enough. Rather, they need to see it as a sign, and they need to believe in him. This term here used, sign, is particularly significant for the book of John. In John, miracles are exclusively referred to as signs, and they all serve a purpose. Signs point to something. They are not ends in and of themselves. And in the very first miracle, the first sign recorded in the book of John, we see the pattern that all of them are supposed to follow. So this happens in John chapter 2 at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, where Jesus turns water into wine. At the end of that scene in John chapter 2, verse 11, we find this. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This sets the pattern. Why the miracles? Well, Jesus does a sign. The sign reveals his glory. People see that and then believe in him. This is the point of the miracles in John. They're not just things that happen. They're not just benefits, but they're signs that point to the glory of Jesus, and that glory of Jesus is meant to be seen and then believed in. Every miracle throughout the rest of John, every sign is supposed to serve that function. But back in John 6, this all seems to have short-circuited. The people see the miraculous provision of bread in the wilderness, and what they get from that is, this man can miraculously provide more food, and so they follow him. But they're not looking past that to the glory. They're not moving past that to believing in Jesus in the way that he wants them to believe in him. And so Jesus challenges them. He directly confronts them, and as the conversation goes on, he keeps raising the stakes. He keeps raising the barrier to believing to make it harder and harder until they come to a point where they have to make a decision. Eventually, at the end of this section, the crowds leave Jesus. More than that, in John chapter 6, verse 66, we find not only the crowds, but after this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. The challenge he puts forward in this chapter reveals that they weren't following for the right reasons. They didn't really see the signs as signs and thus see the glory of Jesus. With that setting in mind, now we can look to the passage itself and see what Jesus means by, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood. What I want in particular to see from this passage, to give an answer to what he could mean, is to focus on the different ways in this section Jesus refers to how one has or receives eternal life. In verse 53 and 54, of course, we find, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. But first, if we're paying attention, we're told to believe in Jesus. Verse 27, do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. Then when they ask what the work to do is, he says, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. This continues in verse 40. This is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him will have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. And verse 47, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. And finally, after the verse in question, verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life, but there are some of you who do not believe. So how do we have or receive eternal life? We believe in Jesus. Similarly, this is made parallel with the notion of coming to Jesus. Verse 35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall not thirst. So they're coming to me and believing in me are made the same. Verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up in the last day. Verse 65, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father. So we're given these two more, let's say, palatable images, believing in Jesus and coming to him. So how do you have eternal life? How do you have life within you? You believe in Jesus, you come to him. That is to say, in the dramatic rhetoric towards the end of the passage, you eat Jesus' flesh and you drink his blood. So what does Jesus mean then by unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you? Well, clearly from this passage, what he has to mean is unless you believe in him, you have no life in you. And we can see further confirmation of this from the most well-known verse in the whole Gospel according to John, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have eternal life. So there again, Jesus answers, how do you have life, eternal life? You believe in him. It's also fairly clear in context, this is what he means. When he introduces this I am the bread of life language, it's immediately after talking about belief. In verse 47, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. So clearly this bread and eating language is metaphorical for believing, for coming to him. What remains is to ask, okay, that's what it means, but why on earth does Jesus frame it this way? And then, does this have anything to do with the Lord's Supper or Eucharist? So first, why does Jesus frame it this way? Well, first, as I've already said, there's a negative component to this. It's to make the bar to believing harder or more stark. This is similar to how Jesus describes the purpose of the parables in Matthew chapter 13. It keeps people out even as it brings people in. There's a dividing feature. So this hard teaching of Jesus, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood, serves as a decision point. Either you accept the teaching and you're drawn further in, or you reject the teaching and you find you're on the outside. So there's a negative function. But there is also a positive dimension. There are deeper truths that this image unveils. First, notice the parallel between the manna in the wilderness and Jesus as the bread of life that comes down from heaven. After the Exodus, God provided for all of the needs of the people by sending bread from heaven. In the new Exodus, in the salvation that Jesus brings, God provides for all of our needs, not with some extra thing, but by providing himself to us, by providing to us Jesus, the bread of heaven who comes down. Second, notice the immediacy and the closeness of it. Jesus does not allow those who follow him to stay at arm's length, to associate with him, but to not be united with him. Rather, to believe in Jesus isn't merely being on his side, but it's being united with him, being part of his body, and taking him into yourself, abiding in him as he abides in you. And even as the food that we eat is incorporated into us, it becomes a part of ourselves, when we believe in Jesus, he is spiritually incorporated into us. We are transformed and remade by him and in his image. Third, notice that there is no other source of life. Just as the physical body will die if you have nothing to eat, the soul that is not nourished by Jesus is dead. And so this image of eating and drinking, taking him truly into us and being remade after his image, is one that calls us into the theology of union with Christ, of being transformed into his image and being nourished, supplied for, and regularly upheld by him. For the second question, does this have anything to do with the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist? Yes, but in a specific way. While, let's say, the Catholic position is that Jesus is directly talking about the Eucharist here through his bodily presence in the bread and the wine through something called transubstantiation, I don't think that's what he's talking about here. As we've already covered, he uses the image of eating and drinking and his body as bread and his blood as drink to show the inner reality of what it means to believe in him. However, there is a relationship between this and the Lord's Supper. Perhaps more accurately, the Lord's Supper says something about what he's saying here in John 6, rather than John 6 is talking about the Lord's Supper. When we receive the bread and the wine, these physical elements, these symbols that we partake in physically, are a way that the Lord is spiritually present with us. And we symbolize and participate in the true union with Christ and being nourished from Christ that is the essence of faith. When we take the bread and the cup, we are enacting something that by God's grace is a symbol and a participation in these deeper realities that are ours the moment we believe. So he uses this imagery knowing that he's going to institute the bread and the cup, and he institutes the bread and the cup because these things are true in this way. So is he talking about that? Well, he's talking about the reality that the Lord's Supper itself proclaims, symbolizes, and participates in.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, visit sbts.edu/sample to access free theology lectures from Southern Seminary.